Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. And in this series of episodes, we're going to look at one of the key battles for Poland and Russia in the 17th century. Of course, I'm talking about the Battle of Smolensk. Smolensk, a name, a city, which is part of Polish history, even to the modern era. And I'm delighted to have with me in the studio my colleague Adam Starzyński, our expert in all things historical and Polish. Adam, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
And the Battle of Smolensk, I suppose the starting point is the death of King Sigismund III Vasa in 1632.
Yes, as you correctly mentioned, the city of Smolensk has played a very important role in Polish history, even until recent times, even though Poland has not been in control of Smolensk now for centuries. It seems that our fate is somehow tied to the city. Not far from Smolensk is, of course, Katyn, where more than 20,000 of our military officers were murdered in 1940. The Smolensk air disaster naturally took place on April 10th, now more than a decade ago. So there is something with the city of Smolensk that reappears in Polish history often. If we look at this war, which started in 1632, the Smolensk War was very much a continuation of the previous Polish-Russian War, the one in which the Poles had taken Moscow, and is probably viewed as the most significant war in Polish-Russian history. King Sigismund III Vasa had passed away in 1632, and as often is, neighboring powers sensed that there could be some power vacuum. There is a young king that takes over the reins, and he's not experienced, so he should be tested, and maybe there will be some opportunities to conduct a land grab. Here it was technically the Swedish king, Gustavus II Adolphus, who felt that this was a good opportunity to expand. He was very involved naturally in the 30 Years' War, ravaging large parts of Western Europe, especially Germany. And here he sensed that it was a good opportunity to take some of his troops and move them into Poland. So he started talking with the Russians and with the Ottoman Empire and see if they couldn't conduct some kind of joint operation against the Poles. The Russians were so eager that they didn't wait for neither the Ottomans or the Swedes, and they thought it was time for them to unilaterally start a war against Poland. The driving force was the Patriarch Filaret, who was also the father of Michał Romanov, the first Romanov king of the Romanov dynasty. The Russians had been preparing for this conflict for a while. They had modernized their forces after the previous hardships that they had faced on the field against the Poles in the previous war. They had learned a lot from the Western powers in Western Europe. Their traditional infantry, the so-called strelcy, had been rearranged by accepting the more modern formations from Western Europe, modern infantry, dragoons, reiters. On October 28th, things really came to an important point when the historical city of Dorobuzg fell, and at the same day the Russian forces reached the fortress of Smolensk, starting besieging it. In that fortress there was a total of 3,000 Polish defenders, and they had the Polish king Sigismund Vasa had modernized the fortress after capturing it from the Russians in the previous war, and they had used a lot of Italian tactics of how to build a very strong a stronghold in the form of a castle. So the Poles were also using some new techniques that helped them to repel the original attack on the castle. The Russian army would continue take another couple of cities in the vicinity, but they mainly focused on taking the Smolensk fortress. You could say that any army trying to invade either Russia from the west or Europe from Russia, these soldiers are naturally funneled through this Smolensk gate, and it's no coincidence that this fortress had been built exactly right there. So the Russians were stopped in their tracks trying to besiege this fortress. In the meanwhile, back in Poland, the new king, Władysław IV Vasa, the one who in the previous war was intended to become the Tsar of Russia, he had taken control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and he was now pushing for the nobility to try to contribute as much money as possible to raise as big of an army as possible. They didn't manage to take care of that in 1632. Instead, the fortress in Smolensk was on its own for a couple of months. But in the spring of 1633, finally the nobility caved in. They came up with a very large sum of money, the largest in Władysław IV Vasa's reign. And they quickly started forming an army that would number 25,000 men. It took some time, so initially a first force of 14,000 men started out. They were under the command of Alexander Goszewski, the voivode of the Smolensk voivodeship, so you could say the regional governor. They encamped in the city of Orsha. Later they moved even closer to Smolensk and set up another camp around 30 kilometers away from the fortress. There they had around 14,000 men, but the army kept growing. However, these 14,000 men, they were already causing trouble for the Russians. They conducted a couple of raids on the Russians, started harassing their logistics lines. Also, on several occasions, the Grand Lithuanian field hetman Krzysztof Radziwiłł managed to break through the Russian lines and send in reinforcements into the fortress in Smolensk. Russian artillery had started arriving. They had been bombarding away. They had been digging tunnels under the fortress, setting off mines that had ruined quite a large part of the fortress. So the situation was quickly becoming critical. However, the Polish army kept growing in size. In the end, they reached their full numbers of around 25,000, more or less numbering the same as the Russian army besieging Smolensk. But then on September 17th, 1933, the Poles received reinforcements from Timofey Ordorenko and his Cossack troops. The Cossacks that had their Zaporizhian host a little bit to the southeast of what is today Kiev. They were a formation that was loosely allied to the Polish king, had declared allegiance. There was a so-called Cossack registry to which the Poles had agreed to pay for the upkeep of 10,000, 15,000. The number varied over time, but there was always this extra army in the Cossacks, you could say, that the Poles could use. So here they came very much into play, and they managed to reinforce the Poles. So the Poles gained numerical superiority. Also, the Poles were able to use their heavy cavalry, the famous winged hussars.
Yes.
Their great mobility forced the Russians to stay in their trenches, and they weren't able to operate so much on open terrain. This also allowed the Poles to raid the logistics lines of the Russians, take some of the strong points that they had set up. And by October, it was clear that the Poles had the upper hand. Finally, they routed the Russians. They fled. They sued for terms of surrender, and the Poles were willing to negotiate. So they basically agreed that the Russians, they had to leave behind all their artillery. They had to lay down their banners in front of the Polish king. But after that ceremony, they were allowed to take their banners with them back to Moscow. They agreed to do this, and also the Poles, immediately 4,000 of the Russian troops, many of them foreign mercenaries, but some Russians as well, agreed to switch sides and joined with the Poles instead. The Poles also had successes on other fronts than just the Smolensk fortress. They had managed to recapture the historical city of Dorogobuzh. They besieged the Russians and a couple of other border fortresses such as Beli, and clearly they had the momentum.
Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.